Good afternoon, Batia Mosquita in Belgium. Nice to have you with us here today.
Good to be here, Anita. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with what interested you in studying emotions across diverse cultures, and maybe you could tell us a bit about your own backstory and your experiences as a Dutch person, perhaps even emotionally adjusting to the US culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to know how you got into a topic of study, right? But I think I've always been interested in people's emotions. I was a really psychologically minded kid. And one of the reasons was that I grew up in a context where emotions were really important. I'm from a Jewish family, and Jewish in the Netherlands meant that people had survived the war, and so there was quite a bit of trauma and experiences that I wasn't privy to. I mean, it's not that my parents were particularly secretive about it, but it was just that the everyday emotional responses were not always clear to me. I wanted to find out what happened in their minds, in the minds of my grandparents, my aunts and uncles who survived. So I think, there was always an otherness for me in emotions to be explained, even if the otherness was very close to me, really. And then certainly what played a role in studying emotions is that I had an advisor who was just writing a book about emotions. Now, of course, I was attracted to that work and I found it interesting, but that played a role. He was a world-renowned emotion psychologist. And then I think, so I did a PhD on cultural differences in emotions, and it was a combination of, he really described a lot of research on emotions in his book, but he didn't address culture very well, culture and social processes. So my PhD research was on cultures and emotions. And interestingly enough, I did research among minorities in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, where I lived at the time. When I studied the emotions of these groups, I learned a lot. But what I really didn't learn is that my own emotions were culture too. So what I did is I looked very carefully, and even if I read back what I did then, I think I was a pretty good observer of emotions in those other cultures. And I contrasted that with emotions as I was used to. And, even with the variety of emotions I was used to, Dutch was still the default. And what I discovered when I came to America and was an immigrant myself is that Dutch wasn't the default. And I think that's probably, I can tell you stories about how it wasn't the default, but I think that was actually the most important lesson that I learned by being an immigrant myself and having to live in a culture where my emotions weren't the currency, so to say.
Yes, there's nothing quite like getting out of your own country and living somewhere else to really have that understanding accentuated. And so that's why in your book, which I find extremely enlightening and mind-opening, that you talk at the beginning very candidly about those experiences. So it's very much appreciated, very straightforward storytelling that I encourage everybody who's watching to read. So as I understand, then that opened up my ideas that, we can't take emotions as universal or taken for granted, and that they are culture specific. That's what I found interesting in your discussion in the book, because you talk about mine emotions that are inside, and then you talk about ours emotions that tend to be out in the world. So that's quite different in how we're affected emotionally. And you propose that North American emotions seem to be inside, always the same, and you use a film as a metaphor to describe that, whereas most cultures have outside emotions that come inward. Can you describe a little more then, perhaps using emotions like love, anger, or shame, and how those mine and ours emotions might work?
I don't think there's any culture where emotions are just mine or just ours. I really think that our emotions are always both. So they're both mental feelings. So the mine and ours are abbreviations for acronyms for mine is mental feelings inside the person, and ours is outside the person and relational acts. And I would say that what I've learned from studying different cultures is that even that cultures differently emphasize those aspects of emotions, but that actually they're useful lenses of use or useful perspective through which you can read any emotion. And so speaking to an audience that I think is largely made up of people who think about their emotions as mental feelings inside, I say, look at emotions from an hour's perspective. Look at what they do in the world. Look at how they fit in relationships. So what we call anger in, let's say in English, and what we call anger in some other cultures has, of course, some similarity, or we wouldn't translate one into the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so what would be the similarity between anger emotions? Well, if I try to say what do they do in a relationship, they almost always say that I'm not accepting the situation as is. I'm not accepting your behavior. I think that I'm entitled to a better treatment. I think something like that is always involved in anger. But having said that, there are emotions where anger is mostly a good emotion or right emotions, and there are cultures where where anger is not a right emotion, and depends on what is important in the relationship. So once you start seeing an emotion like anger as something you do in a relationship, then if I'm in a culture where assertiveness or autonomy or even honor, if you think about honor cultures in general, if those are valued, then anger is kind of a good emotion, because it makes it shows that you're not having other people take advantage of you, that you can stand up for yourself. And in dignity cultures and in honor cultures, those are important things. If you live in a culture where people are where it's not so important to speak up individually, but where it's important, for example, to keep harmony in the group, then anger may be not so valued. And you can think of it as, okay, so there is anger, but other people like it or they don't like it. What does it matter? But really, what is anger? I mean, I'm starting to say that I don't like that. But then doesn't anger change when I expect it to work? So when I expect and actually experience that you are giving in to me, that you're yielding to my claims, or versus the other situation that people think that I'm immature, that they don't give me anything I want, that they just think I'm an antisocial and weird person. So what I'm thinking is that what we describe as anger is best captured as an interaction, as I'm acting, but somebody else is acting too. And in this interaction, that's really where the emotion is shaped. I can give you a similar story for the other emotions as well. So shame is an emotion where you indicate that you're aware that other people are judging you and that you may not meet the norms or expectations that people generally have from you. Some people describe it as the emotion you have to avoid exclusion from the group, which is a nice way of saying, I know that something is wrong, and I don't want it to go wrong. I don't want to be excluded. But then in some cultures, shame is a bad emotion, is a wrong emotion, or at least it indicates that something is really wrong. And here with honor cultures and the dignity cultures are a little bit different. So, in a culture like, white middle class America, I think shame is a really wrong emotion, an emotion that is associated with, that something is deficient about you, and then other people are going to condemn you for it. That is very different for a lot of other cultures in which shame is really a good emotion that shows others that you're a moral person. So that, yes, you may not meet the norms, but you really care about those norms and you want to reach out to make up for anything that may not be good.
So maybe we can move on to more specifically immigrant-focused discussion. And you write about emotional acculturation. 5 years is certainly not enough to become emotionally acculturated in a new society. So when people move out from their homelands to a new country. And I'll quote you here because you wrote, when it comes to emotions, only the third generation of immigrants becomes indistinguishable from the majority. So that's a long time. And I'm wondering, why does emotional acculturation take that long if it does?
It's a really good question, and we don't know everything about it, but I can guess. But let me say first that this is when you look at a whole generation. It's not the case that what we see is that immigrants who have a lot of relations, who interact a lot with majorities, acculturate faster. I mean, in the sense that they can adopt the emotions of the majority culture. It's of course it's not completely clear that people need to have the emotions of the majority culture. And so one of the things that I'm interested in my current research is can we move towards each other? Can there be interaction so that we learn from different cultures, and sometimes it happens. And we know, for example, we've done a little bit of research on high school and middle school youth in Belgium, and we see that if they're surrounded by immigrant children or children with an immigrant background, I should say, and there is the immigrant children are densely connected, so they have a lot of interactions with each other, which you can say if there is a clear minority emotion norm, then majority kids can actually pick up on those ways of experiencing or doing emotions as well. We're doing some other research which is focused on, do we need to have similar emotions? I mean, we know that it's easy when people experience the same interaction similarly. People are attracted often to other people who have similar emotions, and we know that it makes it easy to relate to people when they see the world and feel the world in a similar way to you. But is it absolutely necessary? Isn't it possible to just listen to other people and understand where they're coming from, and have a little more understanding of people's emotions, even if they're not the same as yours? But once again, what we also find is that when you have friends from the other culture, that speeds up your process of learning. And what we think is that really is another way that we usually think of socialization of emotions as something that you do once. Your parents and your teachers teach you how to have and regulate and express emotions. Emotions are a verb in the sense that you constantly do it in the context of concrete relationships. And so your emotions are shaped by what happens in those relationships, by what's meaningful in those relationships, by the responses of other people, by the understanding of other people, by the modeling of other people. We're constantly learning our emotions. We're learning them in interactions. And to the extent that we interact with other people, we are able to learn how how to do emotions in a different kind of relationship. We're able to learn from other people doing emotions in another kind of relationship. Now, of course, when you ask people about all the situations in their life and what kind of emotions they have, you wouldn't expect them to immediately have the emotions of the sometimes they say of the host.
Host country.
I don't like that word because it's the other side of a host is a guest, and I don't like that. But it's an efficient word of saying which society I mean.
Yes, I understand. Yeah.
So, but I think we're constantly adjusting to each other, and what we also see is that the number of years, the proportion of life that a person has been in a new culture also counts. So in the book, I say, when my kids were 10, they had lived 10 years in the United States. Since then, they moved to Belgium. But I also had lived 10 years or longer in the United States, except for me, that was a quarter of my life. For my kids, it had been all of their life. And so when you spend, all your experiences count. Of course, you're not, by spending time in a new culture, you don't become a completely different person, but you also keep with you all the experiences that you had in your former culture, and that you're still having with people who also come from your former culture.
Okay, thank you for that. I also liked your talk about tango and waltz, and I think you've kind of answered that question. So you gave the idea that, if you know the steps to a tango and then you go to another country and they're all dancing the waltz, how can you not step on each other's toes when you're trying to dance? And I think you've given us sufficient ideas about how we can do that through further interaction and cross-cultural relationships. So what might you offer these service providers, police, courts, teachers, and so on about how they can learn more about or take at least into consideration the emotional aspects of other cultures when they're in their roles? Would you like to give us some advice?
I thought that my emotions were default and natural, as I said, and I've only learned the hard way that they're not. But I think that's the number one realization, is to understand what is really at stake, what people think their own emotions mean, what they think they should be doing. So what is it? And in the book, I have a number of examples of misunderstanding of other people's emotions, where I think let them explain what the emotion means, let them explain how they would like the situation to change, what is important in the situation. Try to postpone your judgments. And I think the courtroom is a really good place. What does it mean when somebody's angry? What does it mean that somebody is not showing guilt or not showing shame? Do we really know for other cultures? I mean, I don't even know that we know so sure within our own culture. Be careful and humble would be my first recommendation. My second would be to not just guess or infer what this situation is about, but to try to come to a common understanding, or to try to actually ask the person who is emotional what the situation looks like for them, what is at stake from their perspective. I would also ask them what they feel or what they want to do, and also maybe, is that a good or a bad feeling? Another good question would be, what would this emotion or what would your response mean to people in your cultural environment, your environment preference? Would your mother be happy or not happy that you show this emotion? Would your friends, do they value you, or would they understand if you didn't respond like this? Or do they like that do they see you as a better person for for you having this emotion, or do they see you as a worse person? And I think all of those questions are starting points. And I actually have a kind of a table in my book where I list some of the questions that you can ask. But all of them are starting points to try to not just impose meaning, but to ask for meaning and to try to find it out, figure it out together, what the emotion means and what is at stake for the person that you're with.
Thank you so much, Batya, for joining us. And perhaps I would leave us just with the memory of a film that was once made about Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said, called Knowledge is the Beginning, the East-West Divan Orchestra, and a message for hope. Thank you, and a pleasure speaking with you today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Anita.